in my Vineyard series, which has been bringing viewers a diverse selection of insights and interviews with some of the wine world's leading winemakers and regions. Today we're heading to New York State to meet not one, but 6 of the Empire State's most exciting and quality-focused winemakers to gain a real feel for the dynamic and diverse wines that the region offers. It's certainly a fascinating region, which has long been making some excellent wines, and has also evolved quite remarkably since I first visited, must be some 25 years ago. However, and part of the point of this session, is that until now, few of the wines have been seen in the UK, with a thirsty market found in New England and elsewhere in the States. That's changing though, with producers increasingly setting their sights on export to cosmopolitan markets such as Britain. And this ambition is backed by a growing thirst for individual cooler climate wines and styles among both trade and consumers alike in markets such as this, styles that New York State produces very well. And what I can certainly add, having been fortunate enough to taste quite a few of the wines over the past few years, is that the myriad varieties and styles made certainly fit this sort of fresher, restrained, cooler climate, food-friendly bill. Okay, during these interviews, we'll be covering a wide range of topics. We're beginning with Megan Frank at Dr. Constantine Frank Winery, and Megan will be giving us some welcome background into how winemaking has evolved in New York State. Then we'll meet Rick Rainey and Louis Barruel from Forge Cellars to talk about the diverse geography and how that affects winemaking. Not least the lakes and seas that impact on the climate in Long Island and the Finger Lakes, obviously. This will be followed by Kelby Russell at Red Newt, and Kelby will complement this with further insights into the sub-regional climates. Next up, we have Christopher Tracy of Channing Daughters Winery to explore some of the dominant grape varieties in New York's vineyards. And then it's on to Hosmer Winery, where Julia Hoyle is going to enthuse as to how the typically fresh, restrained styles I mentioned earlier sit well with modern gastronomy. And then last, but very far from least, we'll meet Oscar Binke at Herman J. Weimer Vineyard. And he's going to give us an update on the importance of sustainability, both at that winery and across the state. So, it's enough from me. Let's get on and meet some New York State winemakers. So, hi Megan, good to see you. And I believe we're going to talk a little about how winemaking and the wines have evolved in New York State over the last couple of decades. But first up, could you just give us like a brief intro as to how winemaking began and evolved? So it's like going way back. Why is there a wine industry there?
That is a great question. So wine growing began here in New York State way back in the 1860s. We have a history of growing grapes and producing wine from the American varieties, Vitis labrusca, grapes like Concord, Catawba, Niagara, and that was all around Keuka Lake, which is the lake that I am currently standing behind. We went through Prohibition, and then post-Prohibition, the French-American hybrids became very popular. So the crossing between the European varieties and the American varieties. And it wasn't until the 1950s that vinifera, or the European varieties, were possible to grow in New York State. Dr. Constantine Frank, my great-grandfather, pioneered these varieties, Chardonnay, Riesling, Pinot Noir, to the Finger Lakes region and to the entire eastern United States in his first plantings in 1957.
Fast forwarding, I visited Finger Lakes and Long Island wineries 25 odd years ago. What have been the major changes in the past decade or two in terms of viticulture, winemaking, and thus the sort of styles and quality of the wines?
During the last 2 decades, we've just gotten smarter. We've, learned how to work smarter, not harder. And we've been able to identify specific sites and match them with certain varieties and certain clones to really maximize the potential, of the quality. So that's a big thing viticulturally. We've also learned how to manage our vintage variation. We are in a cool climate here, so making sure that the wines are fairly consistent year in and year out. Working with different techniques in the vineyard to manage the cold damage that we occasionally get a few times every decade. In terms of winemaking, technology has been huge. So the introduction of, fermentation techniques to offer, cool fermentations to really unlock freshness, in the final wines. That's really where we thrive, is these aromatic white wines here in the Finger Lakes.
Okay, great. So to bring this bang up to date, Megan, what further trends and evolution are currently shaping the future? What are we likely to see over the next decade or two from New York State?
Well, the future of the Finger Lakes is very bright. So we have a long history of producing top quality Riesling. We're known as the premier cool climate Riesling producing region in America. But there's a really exciting movement of traditional method sparkling wines that we feel is going to be hugely important in the future. Working with Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and also Riesling. So we have really top quality bottlings, traditional method sparkling that are being produced here. There's also a lot of research and experimentation with new winemaking techniques. So fermenting on the skins with some aromatic varieties, using amphora to ferment wines, so alternative to stainless steel fermentations. Some really interesting winemaking trends. There's also a renewed interest in some oddball esoteric varieties. A few of them being Ricasatelli, Saperavi, some Georgian varieties, also Gewürztraminer, Werner Veltliner, Blau Fränkisch. So we offer a whole lot more than just Riesling.
Okay, Megan, thank you very much. Pleasure. Okay, next we are meeting Rick and Louis from Forge Cellars, and they're going to talk a little bit about the geography and how that affects winemaking in the various sort of areas, wine producing areas. So, hi both. Right, water, whether sea or lake, is clearly a major factor for many winemakers in New York State, along with myriad soils and micro terroirs. Please could you talk us through the key geographical features that define the main viticultural regions in the state?
I'll keep it kind of short and the main components. So number one is the mother rock here. It's shale that was created in the Devonian period about 350 million years ago. That's real key. Then you had a period that was called the Great Upheaval, when you actually had south of here in the Allegheny Range, Allegheny Plateau, that dumped all the water to the north, and it created a bunch of streams and rivers that flowed into the Great Lakes with kind of V-shaped valleys. Then 2 million years ago, you had the Pleistocene glaciation period. Sorry, it's very, very windy here today, as you can see. And we get a lot of thermals up high here. So the glaciation that came through, it turned these V-shaped valleys into these big U-shaped valleys. Then 10,000 years ago, the last period of glaciation came through. And when the glaciers receded, they left behind a lot of material called recessional moraines. And what this did was to plug up these rivers, these valleys, and create what we know as the Finger Lakes. The lake that we're on, Seneca Lake, is the deepest, is 620 feet deep. So it's a massive, massive body of water. The other big component here are, of course, the Great Lakes to the north. Without the Great Lakes to the north, we wouldn't have this great buffering effect of the cold air coming down from Canada. So first, the cold air hits the Great Lakes, buffers it, knocks the edge off, so to speak, and then the final piece of the puzzle is the lakes here right behind us, Seneca Lake, which is really important because it allows us to plant grapes in such a northerly climate. Without those two components, none of this would be possible.
Okay, thanks. So looking more specifically, how do these factors influence the vines and wines at Forge Cellar, for example?
Well, for us, we're focused pretty much on the east side, about an 8-mile stretch along here. And I think you can divide the vineyards into a couple classifications. So you have vines directly planted on the mother rock, which is shale, and there's two variables. How close to the lake are they? What's the slope? How close to the lake for the lake influence, or the distance from the lake? But they're planted on mother rock. That's the key concept. The second part is, are they planted on benches that were created due to damming up of streams? So you have a lot of height here, and all this material wants to go to the lake. So over the millennia, you would have some of these streams get dammed up and create these big alluvial fans. And this is something we've really started to understand more and more. We work on, in some vineyards, that were basically a result of a dammed up stream, or when the lake was at a higher altitude or depth, a greater depth, that created these big alluvial fans. So we have some that are sand, we have some that are gravel, and then of course we have some that are a combination of both. So we have the mother rock, vineyards planted on mother rock, which is shale, and then we have vineyards planted on alluvial plains. Then you have, lastly, vineyards that are planted on glacial moraine, stuff that was left behind from the glaciers. And this can be more gravelly loam, this can be also gravel and sometimes even sand. And this was a result of when the glacier receded. They're the big components. And each one of these vineyards and its proximity to the lake help us to understand the impact of these sites on Riesling. And what we're seeing is, when we have vineyards that are close to the lake planted on sand, we have very aromatic, very pretty examples of dry Riesling. When we're working in heavier soils, the wines tend to be fleshier and fruity. When we're working on pure shale, we have wines that have a lot of power and a flintiness or a smoky element. So all of this is still very much in the making. There's lots and lots and lots to know. Here at Forge, we make, in 2020, we made something like 14 different dry Rieslings, 13 of them coming from different sites. And the differences amongst all of those sites is huge. And now, after doing this for about 10 years, it seems as if each year we're learning more and more about the impacts of the glacier, impacts of the lake on the sites, and the relationship of all of those to Riesling in the Finger Lakes.
And one for you, Louis. Compared with, say, the Rhone, much winemaking in New York State is still in its youth. How important is the concept of terroir, and how has understanding grown as viticulturists and winemakers come to better know their sites?
Hello everyone, this is Louis Barruol from Château de Saint-Côme in the Rhône Valley and Forge Cellars in the Finger Lakes. Okay, about terroir. Well, terroir is the main idea of the French growers, and it has been described by the monks in Burgundy as being the main parameter of quality when they classified the slopes by level of quality. So yeah, it is a very French idea which has spread it out all over the world. As far as it concerns the lakes, yeah, for sure, it's been some time that the producers in the lakes, especially us, tends to classify as well the different level of quality of every terroir on the slope, as when you grow vines on the borders of the lakes, you rapidly understand that not every terroir is the same in the eyes of God, and this is a pretty enormous quality parameter.
Okay, fascinating, good. So what could New York State producers learn from producers in the Rhone and indeed elsewhere with regard to teasing out the best vintage to vintage from their vineyard locations?
Well, learning is certainly a central aspect of our job, as we only cook once a year, as I like to remind it. Yeah, the old countries are certainly a very good source of inspiration, since time is a central parameter of learning in our case, and what our grandfathers obviously did, they did it for good reasons. So Yes, it is important to get the information in the history of viticulture, and the Finger Lakes being a historical site for viticulture as well. I think there is plenty of good learning and good information to take from Alsace, Loire Valley, and great white wine regions.
Thanks, Rick and Louis, and that's great. And next, we're going to join Kelby at Red Newt and talk about climate, both the prevailing climate, but also have a little look at what's happening with climate change. So Kelby, hi. Please could you give us a brief summary of the grape growing climates in the main vineyard areas of New York State?
Hello, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Yes, New York State is a rather large state geographically. I think we think of the city, we don't realize that from one end to the other, it's maybe a 7 or 8 hour drive. It really spans quite a few different regions. But one thing that all of the regions had in common, whether it's Long Island, whether it's the Finger Lakes, whether it's the Hudson Valley, or Niagara Escarpment, any of these grape growing regions in the disparate parts of the state were all continental climates. We're quite cold, and we need a large body of water in order to moderate that. So technically Long Island is a maritime climate, but again, without the Atlantic Ocean, it wouldn't make it as a wine region. And certainly up here in the Finger Lakes, where I'm based, if we didn't have these large bodies of water protecting us during the winter, we wouldn't have vinifera to speak of.
Okay, that's brilliant. And how important is the sort of cooler climate for you and others as a winemaker across the state? What does that sort of allow you to do?
Yes, being cool climate is fundamental to being a winemaker in anywhere in New York State. A cool climate, as opposed to maybe a warmer Mediterranean climate, means that year in and year out, our vintage variation is pretty extreme. And as a winemaker, rather than going into a vintage with an idea of the sort of perfect wine you want to make, you're really responding to what the vintage gives you, what the vineyard gives you, and your job as a winemaker is to really express that the best and the truest way that you can. For us, our sort of flagship wine that expresses that is this dry Riesling. 2017 is the current release. 2017, to that point, was a relatively cool vintage after a really warm 2016. And as a result, we really leaned into some cold soaking with the skins, a lot of lees contact, a spontaneous ferment that lasted a long time, and it allowed us to coax out a lot of weight from a cooler vintage, and also gives us a wine that has really rewarded aging now that it's a current release.
Okay, so onto the sort of slightly thornier and certainly pressing topic of climate change. How is that affecting the regions, and what are the main effects viticulturally that you're seeing?
Indeed, a thornier subject. Climate change is a mixed bag for the Finger Lakes and for New York State, as you would expect. I think as a cool climate, when we used to call it global warming, we thought that climate change would be a net positive for the region, and maybe just an uncomplicated positive for the region. More growing degree days, more ripeness, maybe some new varieties. But as we know, climate change has other things that come with it. The extremes are really difficult for anything, but especially for a plant like a grapevine that likes stability. We're getting higher high temperatures, lower low temperatures, and also more moisture, which in a region that tends to have quite a bit of water already isn't necessarily a great thing. So it's been up and down.
So, okay, what are you then doing, you and others doing, to help mitigate the effects of climate change?
Mitigation is a key part of working with climate change right now. You see people pushing in different directions as we learn how to live with the new normal. One of the things that we've seen a huge rise in across New York State is sparkling wine, which might seem counterintuitive for climate change and warming to start making more sparkling, but it makes a lot of sense for if there's more volatile weather in harvest, if you can bring fruit in earlier, ripe and clean and ready for sparkling wine, it's a really smart move. The other thing that we've seen across New York State, maybe even more so than Riesling, is Cabernet Franc. This is our 2018 Cabernet Franc from Red Newt. Cabernet Franc works brilliantly across New York State. It has different expressions in the different regions. It's really become an all-star for us. And one of the reasons is because in a vintage where it just seemed to never stop raining, which is 2018 for us, Cabernet Franc came through beautifully. We picked it the second week of November. It's made a spectacular, really crispy, crunchy, juicy red wine from conditions that seem almost impossible for that to come from. And picking grapes that work with the direction that climate change is going is the best thing that we can do.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kelby. Good to see you too. And let's keep moving this along. So we're now going to Channing Daughters Winery, where we're going to meet James Christopher Tracy, who's going to give us some background info on grape varieties, the primary grape varieties that you find across the state. James is Long Island based, just to let you know. So hi. James, could you give us a brief summary of how New York State ended up with a mix of grape varieties it has? And what would you describe as the sort of flagship 2 or 3 in the main producing regions?
You asked about a brief summary of New York State and how we ended with the mix of varieties that we have. So remember, New York is one that has some of the oldest growing regions in North America, and the oldest bonded winery in America, and quite a few native and indigenous varieties too. I mean, remember, I have this pretty amazing book called The Grapes of New York that came out in 1905 to show the state of the industry and what was going on, and an evaluation of the grapes here in New York. And there's over 100 varieties listed and talked about, and that is not even including any of the vinifera varieties. Those are just, at that point, native varieties, Labrusca, Vitis Labrusca varieties, things like that, and then hybrids, French-American hybrids, that were a blend of the vinifera and the various native indigenous species. So lots and lots of diversity in grape varieties here in New York. And remember, a lot of things came through New York and through the East Coast before they headed out west. So a lot of the nurseries got those grapes and they were planted all over New York and the mid-Atlantic, and on their journeys out west as well. So we have 7 real main regions here: Finger Lakes, Long Island, Hudson River region, the Upper Hudson, Lake Erie, Champlain Valley, Niagara Escarpment. Lots of different things going on, lots of diversity. Finger Lakes, you know, yeah, Riesling, but great red varieties like Cab Franc and Blaufränkisch as well, and tons of hybrids and native varieties. So you're going to see Diamond and Delaware and Baco Noir and Marquette, and you know, all sorts of various things. I'll get to Long Island last, since that's where we are and that's who we are. So Hudson River Valley, north of New York City, historic, old region, lots of native varieties and lots of hybrids. There is some vinifera there as well, people growing Chardonnay and Tokai, Friulano, and some other things. Upper Hudson, cold climate varieties are going to be seen here. Lake Erie, huge region, I mean almost 20,000 acres, and this is Concord land, I mean the home of Welch's, and so lots of grape juice, table grapes, and you know, kosher wine, all that sort of stuff made from especially Concord. Champlain Valley, northeast corner of the state, Quebec border, again, cold, hardy, a lot of those Minnesota varieties. And the Niagara Escarpment. Then in the northwest corner, Niagara Falls, Ontario border, Cab Franc, Chard, Riesling, Pinot Noir from some of the vinifera varieties, and then things like Baco Noir, Vidal, Diamond, Catawba, those sort of things. Again, you see that stuff all over upstate, from the Finger Lakes to Erie to Niagara to Champlain. Here in Long Island, we're mostly a vinifera district. It was built on Chardonnay and Merlot as the most planted white and red variety, but there's lots of other things that we work with. I mean, here at Channing Daughters, we grow Blaufränkisch and Terraldigo and Lagrine and Dornfelder and Cab Franc, and work with Cab Sauvignon and Petit Verdot. On whites, besides Chardonnay, there's Tokai Friulano and Muscat and Pinot Grigio and Pinot Blanc and Gewürztraminer and Sauvignon Blanc. So lots and lots of things to work with.
Okay, that's great. So how much flexibility is there in terms of varieties permitted, and what are the benefits of such diversity?
How many varieties are permitted, you ask? Unlimited. We can plant and grow whatever we want, and that has a lot of benefits. It's unrestricted, allows us for to adapt, especially to things like climate change, to continue to hone particular grapes or blend of grapes or field blends to particular sites and vineyards, just to have a larger palette, to have a more colorful, more opportunity to reflect and express the place and the terroir where we're growing those grapes.
Okay, thanks. So at Channing Daughters, you work with a wide variety of grapes, and you also make some very imaginative blends. Why not? Why do that? Why not just go down the straight sort of tried and trusted varietal route and stick with mainstream varieties?
You ask about single variety wines. We make a lot of single varietal wines, like Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot Grigio. We also work with blends, as you mentioned too, and we do that because they make more complete, complex, and compelling wines. More opportunities for creativity, to create deliciousness, a larger vocabulary, more color in our palettes. We don't want to stick with just the well-known varieties. It's kind of boring and kind of dumbs things down, and we'd rather be mind expanding instead of cognitive misers. And I don't want to do what everybody else does. We want to keep pushing the potential of what's possible in our region and our vineyards and our cellar, and tell that story in our own way, through our own expression, and flavors and aromas through the grapes we grow on our particular sites. So diversity is key for us.
Okay, and to follow up on that, looking ahead, do you think there should be more focus on fewer varieties and styles that clearly work well, so that New York State as a whole, or at least the sort of sub-regions within, can develop and define sort of USPs? Or do you think the freedom to experiment and match grape to local terroirs is far more important, and the sort of flexibility and diversity should be an important part of the future of New York State?
No, we do not want fewer varieties, especially in a region like Long Island and the Finger Lakes too. There's so many grapes that work well. I mean, yes, there are grapes that do not work well. We're a moderate maritime climate, and with all the benefits and disadvantages that come with that, and being surrounded by water and having water in the growing season. But there are so many grapes, as I mentioned, that we can work with. So we want to keep, again, expanding the potential and expanding the possibility for creating deliciousness, and expanding our stories and the expressions and the reflections of our terroir and our community and our climate. It's boring trying to define, to dumb down. You shouldn't ever talk down to your audience, always talk up. So to try and simplify it for a consumer or the wine trade to help understand a district, that's not, I think, for me, or in my best interest. I want to elevate them and challenge them and offer them an opportunity that's delicious and beautiful, and we don't want to dumb that down or try and make it more simple just to be able to understand it in an easier or more quickly. So yeah, we definitely want to get the best out of our grapes and our region, and that's far superior than trying to just box things in and whittle it down to one or two varieties.
Okay, James, thank you for those insights into the grapes of the state. And now we are going on to meet Julia at Hosmer Winery, and she's going to talk a little bit about the styles of wine in relation to food and being food friendly. So hi Julia, hi. I'm going to ask you to generalize a little bit here. The wines of New York State, or I'm going to generalize, are described as food-friendly styles. Why is this, and what does that even mean?
So New York State, sort of on a global scale, is a cooler region. Not just the Finger Lakes, but even Long Island. Compared to hot climates in the world, it's cool. And what comes along with that is lower alcohol. We also can hang our fruit later in the growing season without getting really high sugar levels. And that is great for flavor development. So you have these wines that are at the balance point of beautiful acidity, but not too much. Really lovely alcohol percentage, not too much to make them fat. And then really great, whether it be really overt fruit character or just lovely richness on the palate of these wines without being too hot from alcohol or too round because the acid's too low. And they're perfect for pairing.
Okay, that's it's beginning to whet the appetite. So could you give some examples of how specific varieties or styles work with popular or classic dishes, whether those be sort of local ones, indigenous dishes, or looking out further afield, sort of modern cuisines around the world?
If it's okay with you, Andrew, I am going to present our two wines that are available in the UK currently to answer this question, talk about wine and food. So our first wine is our Gruner Veltliner, and we've been growing Gruner Veltliner for a little less than a decade at this point at Hosmer Winery on our farm. And our Gruner Veltliner is primarily stainless steel. It does have a small component that is neutral French oak barrel. So, it's this rich, still fruit forward, very sort of like yellow peach driven wine. And when I am drinking that, I immediately go towards some Indian dish classics. So I particularly love bindi masala, and I think bindi masala compared, pairing that with Gruner Veltliner is a great pairing because you have some heat, but you also have the fruit coming from the wine, and the wine's a little bit more plush, so the spice doesn't overrun the wine. So yeah, a lot of whites from this region fill that role really, really well. The other wine I will present is our dry rosé, which is 100% Cabernet Franc. It is, compared to a Provençal rosé, it is darker in color, and that's relatively common in this area. You kind of get the full range in the New York State and in the Finger Lakes. People do either very pale, hyper Provençal-esque, or maybe a little darker. That does not correlate to residual sugar. It does correlate to some really great palate weight in the wine. There's some very, very delicate tannins that come through from a 48-hour cold soak before I press off the fruit and before I start fermentation. That dry rosé, if I'm gonna look right local, I'm thinking grilled fish. We don't have commercial fishing in the Finger Lakes, but people can go out and fish every day. I have family members that do. And that dry rosé with some grilled lake trout is perfect.
Okay, and Julia, what about the diversity in New York State? Is there enough diversity, enough variety to cover most bases for a sommelier on a wine list? So I guess what I'm asking is, if you construct a wine list purely out of New York State wines, wines sourced from around the state, could you literally sort of throw any cuisine at them? Would there be some gaps? Where would they work best with what sort of foods?
New York State makes probably every style of wine that you would want. So if you're looking down towards Long Island, you're going to get some bigger, broader, really Bordeaux style reds, bit more tannic, because they are a little bit warmer and they are more of a maritime climate. Then you come out to the Finger Lakes, and you're going to get these Rieslings that have really great acid for pairing with food. Both Long Island and the Finger Lakes, you're finding great sparkling wines, and who doesn't love method champenoise? Like, everyone loves it. And, we're making that with classic Pinot clones made for Champagne, and also Chardonnay, some clones that are selected out to make Champagne, or Champagne style wine. And you can just find the full spread. And I think that's what's really lovely. You also get dessert wines. I know our ice wine is available in the UK, and that is a, frozen on the vine, picked at 3 a.m. ice wine. So you can get the full spread from New York State, which is really great. And I think a sommelier looking to fill a list with some really cool, delicious wines can find what they're looking for in what we have to offer.
Okay, that's great. And I suppose one of the key points here, just to go back to it, is that typically not light wines, but the alcohol is the ABV is at a refreshing level. How important is that? And I'm also thinking partially in today's sort of health conscious climate, can that be a real plus to help merchants sell the wines onto consumers?
I personally, if I'm hanging out with friends and we're going to be opening up wine, I don't need it to be below, say, 13.5 alcohol. But typically I find that to be a bit more enjoyable. I can have a couple different glasses of wine. I can try a few different things without standing up and going, oh, wow, that one hit me hard, So it's nice to have lower ABV. You can typically have another half glass, and the wines are delicious, so you want to enjoy more.
Okay, Julia, thank you very much. And next up, we're going to join Oscar for the last in our pit stop of New York State winemakers. This is Oscar at Herman J. Weimer Vineyard. Hi, Oscar. Hi, hi. So, sustainability. How much momentum is sustainability gaining across the state as a whole, and why is this important specifically for the wine sector?
All right. Thank you, Andrew. Well, I think what's exciting about the sustainability mission here in New York is that it's gaining a lot of momentum. We are having, not only is it important for us internally, but also our customers are not only wanting it, but also demanding it. You will see that New York as a region are in its, many wineries are in its second generations, third generations even, and the young generation is really taking it seriously. So what we are doing is going pretty fast in some of these fronts on the sustainability side. There are initiatives in Long Island about sustainability certification, and now New York Wine and Grape Foundation is also spearheading a vine balance program. Together with then younger, more progressive wineries, it has again gains a lot of momentum. And why I think it's important for the wine region is, I think the consumer, again, finding it rather important that we're doing it. And since the conversation is rather active on the wine side, we get a platform for the discussion. So it has, I think, compared to some other product, not to single any other product out, but the wine section or the arena of wines has been a good platform to discuss the topic. So I think the wine region or the wineries have a little bit more higher responsibility to get it right. So I think maybe that answers the question.
So, question directed at you, Oscar, would be how far down the sustainability path have you travelled and why?
So I think we've traveled quite far. I know there's more we can do, but our sustainability journey really started 15, 20 years ago, where we saw positive effects inside the winery, being it health of fermentations and so forth, based on changing some of the viticulture practices in our vineyard. That being just eliminating herbicides 15 years ago, for example. Now, fast forward today, we're into 33 acres of biodynamically farmed vineyards, and really taking interest in that and how that affects us and affects the wine. So we're doing quite a lot on that side, but we're also curious what else we can do. And if you look at, we don't necessarily just see sustainability as the viticulture practices. You look at the big picture, being it staff, socially sustainable, financially sustainable, which is rather important. So I think we are trying to keep staff around all year round, so we can create a community here around the Finger Lakes and the area, and also having these small farms here in the Finger Lakes. It's mainly smaller family-owned farms that needs to deal with the ups and downs of weather. It's important that we run these wineries in a economically or financially sustainable practice too. So that is some focuses that we do, and I think there's more to be done, but I think we're doing quite all right.
Okay, well, I think we can say that aside from the not inconsiderable benefits to our beleaguered planet, presumably at least, there must be demonstrable gains in terms of grape growing and quality wine production. But what are those? Is that fair to say? Do we see better quality fruit coming off the vine? Do we see better wines if we're behaving sustainably in the vineyard and indeed in the cellar?
I think yes. The quick answer is absolutely. I think we might not necessarily separate what's good for the world and what's good for the wine. There is a very strong interconnection between the two. You know, you can see that our plans are a micro example. That's our representation of saving the planet. But of course, what we are noticing is that when we take care of the soils correctly, we reduce our input, we work with cover crops, we are using a certified or organic input, and so forth. We see an overall health in the vineyard, which then equates to healthier fruit, which equate to easier efforts on the press pad when we sort, and therefore, and we also see health of soils. For example, just to give a quick example, more nutrients to the yeast, for example. So we see healthier fermentation, and it all. So that's a direct correlation. But I also think there's the as you may be referring to, a little softer side. We live here on the farm. We have staff that work with our fruit and so forth. So it's an overall health betterment for everyone, and it does end up in the glass. Absolutely, it does.
Okay, so final question from me. Regarding sustainability, what more needs to be done?
I think if I go specifically to New York, we are on a very, very positive path where we are really taking initiatives. We need to, right? And we want to. And there's a movement there to it. I think it calls for that customers, or the consumer, I should say, that they are informed also about this. It's a very complex matter. But the more informed the consumer is, the more demand they put on the producers, and that leads to better selections or better choices, I would say. So I think we are, again, on a positive path, and I think we need to also find a platform and a market for these wines that are made to become so responsible. Again, but I think there's so many positive things that are happening out there. So I think it needs to be a little commercially driven also. But again, if you look at around the world, I mean, this is on most of us are on high alert, being it droughts in part of the world or too much rain and so forth. So people are working with erosion issues and water issues. So I think we're, again, continuing spearheading this. Again, back to if the consumer needs it and can then create a market for it, that's how it needs to continue.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Oscar. That's great, and that pretty much wraps it up for our In My Vineyard tour of 6 of New York State's finest. I've certainly enjoyed speaking with you and hearing the answers to all the questions that we posed, and collectively, I think we built up a sort of fantastic picture for those who are new or newish coming to New York State. There's really a lot of fabulous stuff going on there, and if you haven't tried the wines, I'd highly recommend getting your hands on what you can and doing so. So just remains for me to thank New York State for helping to make this happen, and obviously our winemakers. So that's Megan at Dr. Constantine Frank Winery, Rick and Louie at Forge Cellars, Kelby at Red Newt, James at Channing Daughters Winery, Julia at Hosmer Winery, and Oscar at Herman J. Weimer Vineyard. So thank you very much, and hope to see you all very soon in person, and looking forward to the next time I get to taste some of your wines. Thank you, and thanks for tuning in.